My name's Daniel Mercer, 39 years old. I live in a small town outside Chicago, the kind of place where the same faces greet you every morning at the cafe, where rumors travel faster than sound, and secrets don't survive long unless you bury them deep enough. I wasn't the burying type. I was the trusting type. At least, I used to be. I met Emily 6 years ago. She was 27, confident, the kind of woman who could walk into a crowded room and make everyone shut up without saying a word. I was already divorced once, and I swore to myself I'd never let anyone get close enough again. But she wasn't like the others. She laughed at my cynicism, softened the edges of my anger. I told myself she was different. I told myself she was safe. Doc, we moved in together after a year. I worked in IT managing systems for a logistics company, while she climbed her way through corporate marketing, late nights, business trips, networking dinners. I didn't question it much. When someone's been burned before, you either turn paranoid or numb. I chose numb. I convinced myself she was loyal because I couldn't bear to think otherwise. Then, about a year ago, things started to rot. Not suddenly, no. The decay was slow, quiet, almost polite. She smiled less, spoke less, looked through me more often than at me. She was still there, but not with me. I noticed she started locking her phone. Small detail, right? But I remember the first night she did it. She was in bed, half asleep, and I saw the screen flash with a notification. I reached to check if it was her mom. She jerked the phone away like I'd tried to steal it. I laughed it off. Didn't realize I needed clearance. She smiled, but not the kind that reaches your eyes. Just work stuff. Dan, that's how it started. The half-truths, the soft lies, the quiet betrayal that seeps into your skin before you even realize you're bleeding. It was one of her business trips that broke everything. She said she'd be gone for 3 days, conference in Milwaukee. But something about her tone didn't sit right. Too rehearsed, too smooth. The night before she left, she hugged me in the kitchen. I can still feel the way her body pressed against mine, warm, familiar, but hollow, like muscle memory without emotion. When she was gone, I couldn't sleep. Something in me had cracked open. I wasn't the paranoid man I used to be, but I wasn't blind either. So I did what I never thought I'd do again. I checked. Her laptop was on the table. I'd built enough trust in her digital walls over the years to know exactly how to climb them. The first thing I found was her email. Nothing much. Work messages, client reports, nothing suspicious. Until I saw the draft folder. Inside was a half-written message. I'll tell him soon. He's been distant anyway. I just need to find the right moment. There was no address yet, but the attached file was a photo. A mirror selfie of her in a hotel room, wearing that same black blouse she wore on business dinners. The timestamp, 2 nights earlier, when she was supposed to be home late from work. That's when I found the rest. Hidden chats, messages on her secondary email linked to her personal phone, photos, and one name that made me sick to my stomach, Evan Clark. Her colleague, the same man I'd invited to our barbecue last summer. The one who shook my hand and told me, "You're a lucky guy, Dan." He was in almost every text. "You looked amazing last night. He doesn't deserve you. Wish you were still in my bed." And her replies, "Soon." I promised. It wasn't just sex. It was intimacy. It was tenderness. The kind I thought belonged to me. For a while, I just sat there staring at the screen. It's strange how betrayal doesn't hit like a punch. It seeps in slow, cold, methodical. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, my fingers trembling against the keys. But beneath the shock, there was something else, something sharp, a focus I hadn't felt in years. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked around the house we'd built together. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every shared memory, all of it suddenly looked staged, like props in a play I didn't know I was performing in. That night, I didn't sleep. I planned. I didn't know exactly what I would do, not yet, but I knew this. I wasn't going to confront her. Not immediately, because confrontation gives them control. They cry, they twist. They make you doubt what you saw. No, I was going to watch, learn, prepare, and when the time came, I would burn her world down slowly enough for her to understand what she'd lost, and painfully enough that she'd wish she'd never lied to me in the first place. That was the night I stopped being Daniel Mercer, the man who forgave too easily, and became something else entirely. There's an economy to deception. It has costs, ledgers, receipts. It requires performance. If you're going to be lied to, you owe it to yourself to learn the choreography, not so you can be clever, but so you can see the exact moment the mask slips. After that night with the laptop, I did not rage. I don't mean to sound noble. I simply discovered that anger was loud and leaves fingerprints. I wanted to be precise. I wanted the entire architecture of their small betrayal to be visible, the text threads, the hotel bookings, the late-night ride-sharing logs, the petty reimbursements that added up into habit. I wanted not just proof but the narrative, so when I chose to speak, the world would listen. People respond to stories. I intended to give them one they couldn't ignore. The first thing I did was what I always do when a problem needs solving. I compartmentalized. I set aside the husband, who had been cheated on, and became a methodical operator. I went through the motions I knew would quiet the part of my mind that wanted to scream, check, catalog, cross-reference, and then wait. Patience sits in crimes of the heart the same way it does in ledgers. It turns small errors into catastrophic truths. I started with small, mundane observations. If they were careful, there would still be traces, little things people don't bother to hide because they don't expect anyone to look. The coffee shop receipts in a coat pocket, the cab ride after midnight, the hotel keycard imprint on a dry cleaning ticket. I collected these like a man assembling puzzle pieces in the dark. I didn't go looking for drama in the beginning. I watched. I learned the rhythm of their days. Emily had a pattern. Morning gym, lunch calls, client pitches wrapped around that bright laugh she used in rooms of people who polished each other's reputations. Evan had the polished posture of a man who believed his improv could buy him anything: charm, attention, small compromises. They were subtle together the way two people's routines can be. Their schedule fit into each other's like overlapping years. There are two kinds of people who survive betrayal. One is the kind that storms in and burns the house down in a single night. The other is the kind that quietly takes apart the house beam by beam until the owner goes mad trying to put it back together. I chose being quiet. The demolition man gets seen. The slow-on weaver is invisible until the last thread falls. I never told anyone what I was doing. I couldn't. Secrets breed consequences, and I'd learned the hard way that involving friends turns them into liabilities, or worse, moral mirrors I couldn't bear to look into. So I worked alone. Nights became my laboratory. My days were a mask of normalcy. The office, the nods at the reception, the idiotic jokes about traffic in the group chat. Routine is an excellent camouflage, but I did use tools I already had, not to invade anyone's privacy in a lurid way, but to map behaviors. I checked public-facing details, the flight logs for events, the meeting invites that showed up and vanished, the plates of the cars that parked in front of hotels I suspected. I didn't need to break into anything to know these patterns. People who want to be secret rarely invent good secrecy. They invent convenience and call it discretion. And convenience leaves footprints. There's a dirty miracle in watching someone reveal themselves in small compulsions. Emily would text a heart, then delete it. She'd look at the mirror and hesitate. Evan would linger too long at the phone, then slam it shut when coworkers passed. Each micro-gesture was a confession in a language only a careful watcher could read. I learned it fast because I wanted to know every soft place where their carelessness lived. But mapping is different from acting. For weeks I kept my ledger private, compiling evidence into a file that was more like a map than a hectoring tombstone. I labeled things with dates, times, and the shallowest possible commentary. I kept the moral fury on a separate page, because fury makes you sloppy. When you're intent on dismantling a life that once felt like yours, the last thing you want is to be arrested for public spectacle. There's a cruelty in patience that surprises people. They think the cruel person is the one who shouts. They don't see the other kind, the man who learns where someone keeps their favorite sweater, who notices which friends they call when scared, who figures out the private phrase they whisper in the dark, not for intimacy, not to join, but so that when the time comes his push will be irreversible. I began to seed small, calibrated facts, not lies. I don't like lies because they are obvious. Instead, I dropped hints where they would cause discomfort and little social earthquakes. I forwarded a grainy photo, nothing scandalous, just a hotel corridor snapshot in which Emily's hair was half undone, to a colleague of hers who liked to gossip and had a taste for drama. I made sure to mask it as anonymous, because anonymity makes people curious and curiosity is contagious. She replied in an hour with a gasp and the kind of subtle betrayal that spreads through workplace chatter. The rumor caught like lint. I watched the rumor do what rumors do and spool. Invitations stopped coming. Small clients asked for clarifications in meetings and then quietly asked HR for reviews. Emily, who had been so careful, began to receive small, civil emails from people wanting to confirm dates and times. It is an ugly, slow purge having your calendar audited by people who suddenly find your honesty inconvenient. But the elegant part of this cruelty, the part one cultivated with almost academic care, was letting them take the next step themselves. Give a man a rumor, and he will often unmake his own life in panic. Men who think they are masters panic more, and that panic reveals deeper seams. Evan started calling less from his office phone and more from his personal line. He began to leave traceable sloppiness, a booking confirmation sent to the wrong account, a mattress reservation made under a misspelled name, a cab dropped off at a slightly different address. The small mistakes are the real confession. They are the moments of human error that soap and talent cannot entirely scrub. I did not only sabotage them socially, I targeted what they valued. Emily's career had been built on curated presentations and a portfolio of trust. I sent dossiers, clean, quiet, factual, to a few people who sat on hiring committees at agencies she'd longed to join. The documents were professional, sterile, not accusatory. Dates, project overlaps, email headers, and the innocuous-looking attachments that say incompetence when examined by someone who values reputational hygiene. The trick in this kind of ruin is to be boring. Boring is hard to defend against. Lawyers and PR firms calculate drama, but they rarely have a script for people who spread small doubt quietly. In the middle of that slow unweaving, something else happened. I began to see myself split. There was the man on whose desk a file sat labeled evidence, Emily/Evan, and there was the man who used to bring flowers on Thursdays and check her eyelids for the tiredness of someone he loved. The two looked at each other like strangers in a mirror. Sometimes, late at night, I would catch a glimpse of the latter in an old photograph and feel a stab of real grief so sharp it made me sick. The ledger doesn't contain grief. It keeps receipts. I had to keep both because otherwise my revenge would forever feel like an excuse for cruelty rather than an answer. There were nights when I nearly stopped. I would call a friend and then put the phone down. I would draft an email and delete it. Mercy flickered like a candle that didn't want to be snuffed. But two things kept me moving: the evidence in the map and the memory of the way her fingers had once fit into mine as if she had no other world to inhabit. That memory, obscene and tender, hardened into will. There were ethical lines I refused to cross. I didn't vandalize. I didn't smear falsehoods. I was not interested in making her a public villain through lies. I wanted the truth of her choices to be visible, because truth bites in a way lies never do. The difference is messy and important. A lie is a construction. A truth is a weight. Drop enough weight on a building, and it collapses under its own history. Weeks of small moves accumulated. Colleagues who once nodded at Emily began to hesitate. Evan's client list shrank as suspect meetings were rescheduled and then quietly canceled. HR did their thing. They opened a review. Interviews were requested. And in offices the size of ours, whispers turn into formalities faster than you can imagine. The world isn't theatrical. It is petty and procedural. And those procedures are what swallow reputations. But the smaller the collapse, the more lethal the fallout. I watched Emily become hollow in private, the way moths hollow good sweaters. She started to drink, not in a cavalier weekend way, but in the slow, habitual way of someone who needs an anesthetic. Evan grew defensive in meetings. He stopped making eye contact in rooms where he once owned the air. And there, in the middle of it all, I realized something terrifying and clear. There is a threshold after which the cost becomes communal. When you remove someone's livelihood, you do not only punish them, you punish their parents, their friends, the human network around them. Small cruelty expands its radius like ripples in a pond. And then came a moment when things slipped beyond the comfortable arithmetic I'd designed. A file went public somewhere I hadn't intended. An HR memo with a line that named Emily in a way I had not prepared for. I hadn't leaked that one. I had built plausible deniability into every move. Someone else had chosen escalation. The public attention that followed was merciless in its dryness. Not the dramatic headlines, but the small lines that matter. Employee under administrative review. Client relationships being reassessed. People look at those things, and they draw conclusions. The salt in their eyes is quiet and judicial. Emily called me in a voice I barely recognized. "Someone is trying to ruin me," she said. "I think they're targeting Evan. Please, Dan, I need someone to vouch for me." The impulse to step forward and plead for her to be spared hummed in me like a live wire. But I had made rules, and the soft part of me had been sequestered behind those rules. "You did this," I said instead, and the words felt like stones dropping through my chest. She cried, and her sobs were like a confession. "Please," she begged, "don't." I held my ground because the ledger must be paid, and because I also knew something else. If I stepped forward now, everything would be undone. The slow, brittle things I'd put into place would smear into a messy spectacle. Revenge, carefully built, becomes useless when you explain it away with declarations of love. She began to panic. Panic is honest in its idiocy. It makes people reckless. She stopped hiding her phone. She crashed through meetings without rehearsing, and she made small, obvious errors. Evan, cornered, lashed out privately and publicly. His temper, once the charming swagger, became a hazard. He made a mistake at a client meeting that cost him a contract. Contracts evaporate like stage smoke. He called his mentor and then called me, voice trembling with a kind of quiet animal desperation I'd never heard in him before. "You think this is about love," he said once over the phone. "You think I wanted this." I didn't answer. I had learned that answers are weapons people use to confuse. Silence is a different weapon. You can deny with fury and the world will spin with your denial. You can be silent and watch the world fill in the blanks itself. One night, after a small scandal where a client publicly withdrew, Evan showed up at my doorstep. He was not pleasant. He looked smaller and harder, as if the weather had carved him down. He accused. He threatened, thinly, like men who believe threats are armor. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You'll regret this." I made him sit. I poured coffee because somewhere I still kept old habits. We talked, and by talked I mean we performed civility, until the tension between us was a taut wire. I wanted to ask him why he had thought he could take another man's life like a hobby. Instead, I asked what he valued more, his career or his appetite. He gave me an answer that was both dumb and useful. "Both," he said. That night I learned Evan had debt. I learned he'd invested in things that required constant cash flow. I learned he'd been counting on the firm to prop him up. Small facts became levers. People are rarely ruined by a single exposure. They're ruined by the chain reaction it sets off. Cut one wire and a dozen relays trip. That knowledge is not noble. It is an observation I used. And then the thing that finally made the ledger feel heavy. Someone died. It wasn't Tom. It was small at first, a message about an accident on a narrow road. A slip into water. The papers called it accidental, the local news made a short paragraph. And the small world of our town moved on with the speed of olfactory forgetfulness. But grief has a way of expanding the quiet in a room. For the first time since I'd begun, I felt the ledger bite in a way that was not strategic but personal. A life had ended, and even if my list and his were only tangentially linked, the moral brush had splattered paint across hands I'd never wanted to touch. I thought of stopping then. I even half-packed a bag once and imagined leaving a small town, a new identity, a quiet life. Those are fantasies people tell themselves when conscience peeks around the corner. But leaving is a form of surrender that privileges the comfort of the powerful. I found I could not walk away from something I had made, and that now had its own inertia. So I continued. By the end of that second month, the pattern had shifted. Where before they'd met in private dinners, now they met in jittery, hurried text exchanges. Where before they'd smiled with a confidence that made rooms hush, now they flinched when chairs scraped. Reputation is a ledger written carefully over many years. It is slow to build and almost effortlessly fast to tear. I am not proud of what I did. People who speak of revenge as if it is a war they're entitled to win show a brutality I cannot reconcile. But there is a truth here. Once someone gives you a reason to act, the world will reward your action with both consequence and cost. The ledger draws its own interest. When things escalated to the point that Emily was offered, and then declined a settlement in a quiet HR mediation, I realized how far I'd come. She could have taken the money, the assisted gloss of separation, and disappeared into another curated life. That would have been the easy ending for both of us. She did not take it. She was not at all the person she once had been. Her refusal felt like pride or maybe self-destruct. I couldn't tell. In the end, the art of pretending is not about deception only. It's about living in a double world where, on the surface, everything looks ordinary while underneath, you are quietly rearranging the furniture so that when someone stands up, the floor gives. It is a lonely craftsmanship. It is surgical cruelty disguised as moral rectitude. Part to close with us standing on different sides of a fault line. She with her sarcasm turned inward, Evan with his hands empty and shaking, and me with a thickening ledger that had become less about evidence and more about vengeance. I had learned to calculate the cost. The next step was brutal, to make their ruin public in a way that could not be quietly scrubbed. I had to decide what I was willing to sacrifice to make them feel the truth of their choices. There's a peculiar sound the life makes when it starts to unravel, a low, brittle creak like floorboards after a long winter. For weeks I'd been listening for that creak in other people's houses. By the time I decided to make the ledger speak out loud, the creaks had turned into a chorus. Turning paper into noise is a craft. You don't throw files into the wind and expect thunder. You plant them where a whisper will become a conversation, and you make sure that conversation has ears in the right rooms. I wanted the kind of exposure that didn't die in an HR memo. I wanted donors and clients and the people who care about appearances to feel the heat in their calendars. Reputation is a currency. Make it unstable, and the people who rely on it will act faster than a judge. So I wrote, not a screen, a careful, sterile document, dates, times, headers, attachments. I organized the evidence to read like a professional audit rather than a scorned husband's manifesto. That mattered. A messy file ends up in the trash. A clean file becomes a legal problem. I sent identical packets, anonymized and encrypted, to 3 places. One journalist whose work I trusted to be exact. One board member at Emily's target agency who'd once told me in a bar that integrity mattered, and one external investigator at the logistics firm where I worked, someone with teeth and the patience to follow subpoenas. The first hit came slower than I imagined. The journalist, a woman named Claire I'd found through a buried byline, called me and we met in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and old notebooks. She had eyes that didn't blink at scandal. "You didn't send me this to ruin people," she said when I slid the USB across the table. "You sent this because you wanted them to be accountable." I didn't correct her. Words like ruin and accountability look the same in the press. It's the byline that decides which one sticks. Her piece was surgical. She framed it not as a melodrama, but as a forensic look at conflicts of interest, at how small, private transactions leak into public injustices. She quoted dates, not emotions. She published on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the board member I'd contacted had convened an emergency meeting. By Friday, the agency put Emily on leave pending investigation. Clients asked for clarification. A mentor called Emily to say he needed to think about optics. Those are the polite words institutions use when they're deciding whether to protect you or your money. When reputations wobble, lawyers smell opportunity. That was the second wave. The external investigator at my company, a blunt man named Hayes who spoke like an accountant and fought like a debtor, filed motions, issued subpoenas. He took the cold file I'd compiled and dressed it with process. The kind of machinery that moves money toward accountability started clanking, and then the panic set in. People panic in predictable ways. They call their friends who have better lawyers. They reassign projects. They close the small doors that let heat escape. Evan tried to be brave in one meeting and failed spectacularly. He stuttered through an explanation, and then blamed a software glitch. The room went silent in the way of people who are choosing sides, and someone from legal coughed and asked HR to hold the line. Emily called me that afternoon from a payphone because she dared not use her personal line. Her voice was paper-thin. "They're freezing my access," she said. "Dan, I need you." Up to a point, I could have walked back. I could have let the procedures roll their slow course and let the firm chew and spit them out like cheap gum, but I'd already crossed a threshold. The ledger had teeth now. The teeth needed to be felt. A quiet suspension wasn't punishment. It was exile cushioned by bureaucracy. I wanted the consequence to be real and visible. So I escalated carefully. I dropped the second package where it would matter, to a small but influential industry newsletter that advised agencies on client vetting. The package included an annotated timeline and a redacted set of emails that showed a pattern of deliberate misreporting. The editor ran it as an advisory note. People listened because it sounded like risk management. Contracts evaporated. Offers were rescinded. When money flows away, human temper follows. Evan reached out to me again, this time not to threaten but to bargain. "Please," he said, voice low and urgent over the line, "I'll leave. I'll transfer everything I have to a trust and resign. Don't do anything more. It'll be quiet." He sounded like a man trying to bargain with a storm. I thought of Tom's voice in my head and how hollow it had sounded the last time I heard it. I told Evan what I'd been telling myself for weeks. "You can leave, but you can't unspool the threads you've pulled. People will remember." He left a week later with a thin envelope and a practiced apology. He published a short, stilted statement about errors and regret. It didn't stop the cascade. He was a node, not the source. But his exit made the system reconfigure. Other small men who'd relied on him for cover suddenly looked less insulated. And then the ledger demanded a price I had not been able to foresee. Attention draws other attention. Among the emails and calls and polite rescinds, someone else noticed my pattern of interference. Not everyone who pays attention is a friend. One night, I came home and found my mailbox had been rifled through. Flyers from a local charity slid on the floor, my name crooked on an envelope. My apartment felt like a pocket that had been turned inside out. A note was stuck to the fridge, printed on cheap paper. Stop. No signature. No hint of irony. I felt the weight of it the way men feel a look across a room. The ledger had gone public, yes, but it had also exposed me. I had traded invisibility for truth, and someone or some group had decided I had become a problem to be solved. The next morning, there were two new problems. First, a local reporter who'd been friendly called asking if I'd comment. I refused, then thought better and agreed to a short, measured statement. Second, I found an envelope in my briefcase with a photo, grainy but unmistakable, of my mother unloading groceries, the grocery bag pressed with our town's little logo. Someone had been watching not just their supposed betrayers, but the people attached to them. Panic has an ugly cousin. Fear that turns sensible people into irrational ones. I started to see it in the world I'd created. Emily, who once called me for help, now avoided me. She would answer my messages with 3 words and then go dark. She was, at moments, broken in ways that made me ache. The ledger had hurt her more than I'd wanted. But this was the dangerous arithmetic of revenge. It wants to be complete. And while the legal motions and news cycles churned, another undercurrent formed, the sense that someone else was writing in the margins of my book. Anonymous messages turned into veiled threats. My car's tire was slashed in the middle of the day. A voicemail on my work phone, something someone left with the poise of a professional, said simply, "You can break them, but you can't escape what you break." That night, alone in the apartment that had once felt like a shared nest, I realized something that had been gnawing at the edges of every plan I'd made. Exposure is two-edged. I'd sharpened a tool and now I had to hold it in both hands. If I wanted to continue, I had to accept the cost, not just for them, but for anyone near me. The ledger doesn't care for nuance. It only balances. I slept poorly. Dawn came like an accusation. The phone buzzed. Detective Alvarez. He wanted to talk about the slashed tire and about the photo of my mother. He asked if I felt threatened. I lied and said I did, but I didn't tell him how small the threat felt next to the fact that I'd smashed a life in order to make a point. There's a dangerous clarity that comes when you see the map spread out and understand who the corners belong to. You also see who will move when you strike. That knowledge sharpens your appetite and narrows your options. The ledger had become a ledger others wanted to read, and not everyone who reads wants the same thing you do. When the dust settled on that third week, the firm had initiated an independent audit. Emily's future was hazy, and a handful of contracts were gone. I had forced consequence, but I had also called attention to myself in a way that was irreversible. The ledger's pages were wet with ink and consequence. They would not dry cleanly. On my kitchen table that night lay a new envelope. No return address. Inside, a single photograph of a group of men at a riverside picnic months ago, Evan among them, laughing, and then, off to the side, a face I did not recognize, but whose eyes seemed to catalog the world like a man who keeps lists. Someone else had been watching the watchers. The book was beginning to fill with names I had not written. The ledger had been shared. The question now wasn't whether I could make them pay. The question was whether I could survive the company I'd kept. The ledger does not forgive mistakes. It simply adds them up and shows you the total when you are too tired to look away. After the river photo, my sense of being watched hardened into a daily fact. I started sleeping with the light on for an hour, then 2. I changed routes to work and back. I took taxi apps and paid cash. Paranoia is a luxury I hadn't afforded myself before. Now it was a necessity. Every pause in a crosswalk, every stranger who lingered at a corner felt like punctuation. Someone had annotated my life and sent it back with a small, polite warning, back off, or the ledger will hurt you too. Detective Alvarez came by twice that week. He is the kind of cop who keeps his face still until he knows the pulse of a confession. He wanted names, he wanted proof, and he wanted me to stop doing anything that might get me arrested. I pretended to listen, I pretended to care. Part of me did. The other part had the taste of unfinished arithmetic in its mouth. "You started something," he said once, in a voice softer than the one he used to read warrants. "I get that you were wronged. But this is bigger than two people in a dim hotel room. Whoever's pushing back, they're not sentimental. You think I should stop?" I asked. He studied me like a man measuring a danger he didn't yet understand. "I think you should be careful. People who hide money don't mind getting their hands dirty. People who profit off silence, less so." There it was again, the phrase that lives in the mouth of everyone who's ever been comfortable with other people's quiet. They have resources. It sounds like a fact, but it's a threat dressed as information. I kept pushing anyway. The more I pushed, the clearer the pattern became. The riverside picnic photo had a watermark so faint I almost missed it. A food caterer, a small company that services private events. I called them with a casual lie about pricing for a charity event. The woman who answered remembered the picnic and mentioned a rental crew for a security tent. It was an odd phrase. People don't rent security tents for picnics. They rent them when they want a place where a few men can sit in the shade and not be bothered. I found the tent company's documents in a trash bin across from my office. A careless crew had tossed them in the night after the picnic. Hidden in the fold was an invoice for the tent and a one-line note. "Special client, choose no records." The name of the client was an initials-only box, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable if you know how to read signatures. Slanted, confident, careful in the loop of the G. I'd seen that G before. I'd seen it on a document that used to make my stomach cold, an old vendor agreement from a contractor who did small, tidy jobs for companies that needed plausible deniability. I started to stitch things together: the tent, the man at the riverside, the phone calls that had been scrubbed, and a growing sense that what I had poked with a stick was a wasp nest. The wasps were not the sort of creatures that die easily. The more I catalogued, the more personal the retaliation became. A pair of men followed me one afternoon from the grocery store to my building, keeping polite distance until the elevator opened, and they were gone. A threatening voicemail left on my work phone suggested my mother's name again, this time with a street address included. Someone had driven by and made a note. Someone had done the mundane work of mapping the people around me. Mapping that is a kind of love for the cruel. And then, the knock on my door. It was late. It felt like someone waiting in a movie, which is to say it felt wrong in every particular. I moved to the peephole and saw a man in a dark jacket, breath puffing in the stairwell like a distant light. He held a cardboard envelope in his hand, the kind that bends and stains in the rain. He didn't look like a messenger. He looked like someone who had practiced being without expression for a long time. "You Daniel Mercer?" he asked through the door. My brain listed the options. Call Alvarez. Keep the chain of custody. Pretend not to be home. But I opened the door an inch because a man with a ledger learned small courtesies matter. He slid the envelope under the door and left. No face, no sound inside. The envelope was thin. A single Polaroid of Claire, smiling at a coffee shop, a place she used to take me on Sunday mornings. It was not recent. On the back, in block letters, "Don't push, stop," no signature. The kind of message that pretends to save you and only tightens the chain instead. I called Claire. She didn't pick up. I called Alvarez and left another message, something wired and unhelpful. I got another one. He called back within the hour with the kind of calm that contained an order. "Do not go after this alone. Let us handle the contactors. They would up the ante," he said quietly. The tone in his voice had dropped into the register of men who had chased similar ghosts for too long. Alvarez's suggestion was sensible. My hands didn't listen. Sensible is a mode of living I had abdicated when I knew the names and the faces, and the way Evan had looked at me in my own kitchen. I needed movement. I needed to see, to hear, to put a hand on the thing that had my life loose. I told Alvarez I'd meet him at precinct the next morning for whatever he needed. In truth, I planned midnight. At 2 in the morning, I parked 2 blocks from the deserted warehouse address I'd pulled from the tent company folder and watched. The cold scraped my face. There were shadows moving inside the building, people awake for reasons that were not their own. The river nearby sweetened the air with a wet, chemical smell. I slipped along the back of the building and found a rusted service door. It gave under a judicious kick and a quiet shimmy. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil and cardboard and the faint perfume of someone who wanted the room to smell neutral. Candles and cedar and the kind of items that make men feel tidy. It was too manicured for a place that stored illicit things. Someone had a taste for aesthetics. A light clicked on somewhere inside. Footsteps. I froze like a hunted animal that knows its movement is loud. They were closing in on me, but not with direct menace. They were moving with industry. I ducked behind a stack of pallets and watched a small group of men move through the space. A tall man with a scar I'd noticed in the picnic photo. A shorter man with inked hands. A third who wore a suit like an apology. The tall man, he had the G in his scarf loop habit, moved with calm authority. The three of them gathered around a table where crates were being opened. I saw ledgers, receipts, and a laptop. They were cataloging. They had their own ledger. I had a choice. Run, call Alvarez. Get a warrant. Be patient. I chose stupid. I stepped out, hands empty. Who are you? I asked loudly, the way a man tries to dislodge surprise with noise. The tall man looked up slowly as if I'd walked into a painting. You shouldn't be here, he said. His voice was carefully unhurried, an instrument of measured irritation. The scar traced his jaw like a punctuation mark. You're the one with the picnic photo, I said. You've been watching me. He smiled with a light I wanted to slap away. Everyone watches, he said. Some of us are better at it. The short man laughed. The suit man closed his laptop with a tilt of disdain and stood. The air folded like a paper under pressure. The next thing I remember is a hard, clean blow to the ribs that knocked my breath from me. Pain lanced the right side of my chest and I doubled over. A hand from the suit man caught the back of my neck and pushed me down onto a crate. They tied my hands with a zip tie like they were preparing me for processing. The scarred man leaned in close, his breath stinging like peppermint. You picked a bad ledger to play with, he said gently. You were a useful pawn. That was before you started making noise. I heard the echo of Alvarez's warnings then, like a memory dredged up too late. I tried to reach for the small voice recorder in my pocket, the one I kept like a private litany. The tie tightened. They weren't vicious in the way cartoons teach you. They were efficient, a press of a palm to a jaw, a calculation of leverage, a business-like folding of punishment into instruction. It was all language messages rendered as bruises. You will stop, the scarred man said. You will let this be managed, or the ledger you so carefully assemble will include things that belong to your mother, to your neighbors, to people who have nothing to do with this. I tasted metal and thought of Tom and of other people I'd never meant to hurt. The ledger had become a ledger that other hands could write in. I had begun a book someone else was now finishing with my life as margin notes. When they shoved me into the back of a van, the city looked like a set of cold stars, indifferent and precise. They drove me to a strip of developments by the river where anonymous men do anonymous work. The scarred man stepped out and looked at me as if cataloging residue. You wanted the ledger to speak, he said. Now we'll speak to you. Learn to read it. They left me there on a metal table beneath harsh fluorescent light, hands still numb, dignity shredded into zip ties. For a terrifying minute I thought of calling Alvarez. Then I remembered the Polaroid of my mother and the cheap paper. I thought of the ledger in my drawer and how heavy it had become. The ledger had been a weapon. It had become a beacon. They had lit a signal. Someone else had answered. I lay there until the sun thinned and my lungs came back. My phone was gone. My hands ached. My head had a new rhythm. My ledger was in my drawer at home. I pictured the pages like scores in a music I no longer controlled. When I finally made it back to the apartment and collapsed at the kitchen table, Detective Alvarez was already on the line. He'd been called, some neighbor or camera had pinged the Vanway station. He asked if I was all right. I lied. I said I'd taken a spill near the pier and would be at the precinct in an hour. I kept to my lie until I'd packed a small bag. I called Claire once and left a message I didn't intend for her to hear. If anything happens to you, I will bury them all. Then I deleted it because threats are cheap and mistakes are irreversible. They had not only struck back, they had expanded the ledger into a ledger I didn't write. And they had shown me in the most practical terms that the world I'd poked contained people who could make your life into a footnote. At dawn, with my ribs still raw and my hands still tingling, I made a choice. I could stop, turn the files over, apologize, live under the quiet of erasure. Or I could go back in, but smarter, angrier, and less alone. The scars on my ribs made my jaw clench. The ledger lay on the shelf like a sleeping animal. I decided to pull one more thread, one that would force a face out into daylight. It was reckless. It was necessary. It was the only thing left that felt like truth. And so I started, with a single name I hadn't yet written anywhere. The name engraved faintly on a receipt I'd found in the tent folder, the one that matched the G on signatures. I would go find who that G belonged to. I would ask him why we had been marked. If the ledger was a book of debts, then I was about to take out a page and write my name in bold across it. When you stage an ending, you expect it to feel like a tidy exhale, a courtroom sigh, a headline that snaps the world back into sense. Life is not that generous. Endings are messy and loud and take pieces of you with them. The way a tide drags seaweed in shells from a shore and leaves only the ache of what's missing. I'd sworn, more than once, that I would close this ledger and put it away. When I lay awake in the apartment after the van and the zip tie lesson, I pictured myself folding the pages and walking out. But the ledger is a poor thing to bargain with. It remembers, and it keeps calling. The scar on my rib throbbed when I moved. My hands still tightened when a stranger passed too close. But the notebook had other plans. It nudged me toward the one name I'd been circling like a worried dog. The G who'd signed the tent invoice. The one whose handwriting traced the scarred man's presence up the riverside. His name, traced in looped ink on a vendor sheet, read like a promise. Graves and Co., a contractor that, on paper, dealt in benign things, tents, staging, logistics. In practice, it was a scene. The problem with scenes is that they connect rooms you'd rather not open. Alvarez warned me to hand everything to the precinct. You're not an investigator, Dan, he said once, voice a tired rope. You keep poking at wasp nests, and I'm the one who'll have to pick up the sting. I hated his words, quietly, because he was right in the way soldiers are right, blunt and necessary. But I'd learned a thing about monsters. They talked to one another. The bad men were not above repeating the same mistakes. They bragged. They left notes where they shouldn't. Pride is a terrible security measure. So I did two things at once. I fed Alvarez the paper trail I could not legally deny. I told him where the tent company invoice had come from and who the scarred man might be. He promised subpoenas, and the slow gears of subpoenas grind into motion. And while the law began to move like a great animal waking, I set a trap built from people who had no interest in caution. Danvers, the journalist I'd used before. Samira, who had a talent for logistics I'd only lately learned to appreciate. And Claire, who in her collapse had found a center I hadn't known she still owned. Claire's participation surprised me. After the van and the Polaroid, and the nights she didn't sleep, she called me with a voice that had in it something like resolve. If I'm going to be in this, she said, I want to do it on my terms. She had begun to hate the way other people's small cruelties had turned into a household item she carried everywhere. Help me make this mean something, she said, and for a moment I thought I saw the woman I'd loved. Our plan was simple because complicated plans fail in the hands of tired men. We'd stage a meeting one that appeared small and private but would be witnessed. I'd bait the G into proving himself in a way he couldn't later deny. Danvers would make sure his cameras were present. Samira would handle the route and the backup. Alvarez painfully agreed to have an officer on call nearby once he heard enough of my paper trail to move. We needed bait he'd find irresistible, a ledger entry that promised discretion and profit. I cooked a fake brief, a municipal contract routed through an oblique charity, with a plausible payoff dangling at the end. I had the right names. I had the right dates. I hid the file inside a USB roll where video files and invoices interleaved, and I placed it where I knew men like him would look, in a shared server used by small event contractors and maintained sporadically by people who trusted their friends. It took 3 days. The bait vanished the moment the server logs pinged, and a follow-up message came to me through channels I pretended not to know how to use. The scarred man wanted a meeting. He wanted to square accounts. He wanted a place where men could speak without law and with the kind of certainty that men like him cherish. Warehouse where he chose to meet was the same place they kept the pallets and the crate of fake receipts, a place I'd been in before with a bruise under my ribs and a memory that tasted of copper. This time I came wearing a jacket that carried nothing that could incriminate me and a recorder hidden inside my cuff. Claire came dressed in a way that made her look like a woman who'd learned to be careful about cameras and careless about men who thought themselves invisible. Samira trailed in the roof line. Danvers parked blocks away with his crew and a set of lights that passersby would think were for a documentary about industrial spaces. Alvarez was in the shadows with a warrant in his pocket and patience in his face. The scarred man arrived on time, as all professionals do. He wore the same loop in his scarf he'd brought to others, the suit with the laptop, and another man I'd never seen before, clean-shaven, eyes a little too bright. The scarred man smiled like a man who knew how to make other people's bones comfortable in his hands. "You kept quiet a while," he said when I walked in. "That was polite of you." I met his smile with a small one of my own. I like to be thorough. They pulled the folder open. It was the bait, polished and plausible. The scarred man leafed through the fake invoice, his fingers touching the paper like a man who remembers the feel of money. He suggested terms, percentages, timelines. He started to narrate the way contractors move funds through charities and how small men are paid out of sight. He wagged his hand in a way that thought itself charming. Then he made the mistake all men do who believe themselves safe. He talked too much about a method and used a name I'd been circling. Said it like it belonged to him. "Graham's counsel will make the cut clean," he said, naming the lawyer I'd called weeks earlier under another pretense. "He signs a thing and the money slips through. We all get what we need. No fuss." Danvers didn't move the camera. He didn't need to. A camera wasn't the only witness. Samira had a small transmitter tucked under crate, and Alvarez had already started the approach. I let the words hang. The scarred man filled the space like a man who had been paid to be a voice. He laughed about logistics, slipped phrases that to a man like me meant more than they should. Special client, no records, plausible deniability. He even joked about a name Tom like a polite aside. He didn't know that the cuff button in the corner of my sleeve had been eating his voice in raw, uncompressed audio. When he finally leaned back with the satisfied look of a predator who believes his meal is certain, Alvarez stepped out of the shadow, and the two officers who'd been waiting moved in. The scarred man's face changed first to calculation, then to fury, and then to a brittle kind of bargaining. He tried legalese, his suit turning into armor. He offered names, some true, some irrelevant. He tried to buy the silence with threats. That's when the genius calculation became permanent. Danvers' camera caught not only his voice, but the way his hands made signatures, in the air gestures, that later tied him to contracts. Alvarez could subpoena. Samira's transmitter had already fed the audio to Alvarez's team. The badge flash and the sudden bright lights of police cars turned the warehouse into a stage with the curtain ripped away. They cuffed them. Graham's counsel, the lawyer named, arrived, furious, trying to salvage narrative. But Alvarez had the warrant for the laptop, and the pallet ledger, and the papers pulled from the tent company old Phil. The scarred man swore and twisted, but the facts were net, the invoice numbers, the tent pickup order, the matching payments routed through trust accounts that a subpoena coaxed open like a reluctant flower. In the following weeks, names fell into courts like ripe fruit. The campaign I'd controlled for months became a tornado the law had finally decided to step into. There were arrests, indictments, searches of offices that had once felt impervious. Graham's name surfaced in wire transfers. The tent company's invoices matched payments in shell accounts. The firm that had paid out hush money found its trustees in depositions. Their oxygen of reputations flickering, a small handful of men who liked to think themselves untouchable were suddenly in a world that measures things with subpoenas and jail cells. But the ledger had never been an instrument that returned only justice. The ledger asks for an accounting that includes collateral, and collateral arrived in the currency of human ruin. Claire testified. Her voice was steady but quieter then. She had been in the apartment when she laid out receipts for me in that first week. She lost friends, she lost prospects, she lost in the quiet folding of reputations, a career built of curated trust. Denver's outlet won awards, and then pseudo lawyers arrived asking for settlements. His life turned into the tiny, jagged business of defending the truth he'd helped make visible. And me, the law wanted answers, and I gave them. I did not hide the anonymous packets or the small, precise sabotage. I told Alvarez everything because the ledger had become a ledger other hands were finishing, and I wanted my story to be the one that sat beside the evidence at trial. They questioned my methods in public hearing rooms where men with ties wore calm-like clothing. They called me reckless, a vigilante, a man who took the law into his hands. I did not argue that I hadn't been reckless. I had also been honest about the motives that had pushed me there. There were consequences. Civil suits arrived from people who'd been pushed out of jobs and then said that their names had been smeared anonymously. Emily sued for defamation for a packet she claimed had been falsified. The court examined metadata and found a messy truth. Some things I'd fed were real, some things were curated emphasis. The judge called it moral ambiguity rendered in evidence. The phrasing made me want to laugh and then made my chest ache like someone had folded me. Tom's death was prosecuted. Some of the men who'd facilitated the network were convicted for obstruction and for hired violence. Tom's name got a measure of public justice, but not all the people who had the means to hide did time. The system is patient and inventive. Money buys time, time buys obfuscation. Some men slipped into foreign corners, and the law's reach thinned like a rope pulled taut. Claire left on a few months after testimony. I walked her to the door of the program where she'd been granted relocation and a new name. She gave me a folded scrap of paper that said only, "You wanted the ledger to speak. It did. Now go. Be quiet." There was no malice in the words, only a weary request. I put the paper in the back of the ledger, an archival note like the ones I used to leave myself in the margins of spreadsheets. The ledger is on my shelf now. It is a heavy thing, and not because of its pages but because of the lives it catalogs. There are names I added and then crossed out in the years that followed because lives change and the law eventually moves in a way that counts. I have copies placed in safe deposits and with Alvarez and with Danvers and in a folder labeled for when someone asks. I sleep badly. I walk differently. When I pass the riverside, I think of the picnic and the man with the scarf, and I feel the ledger tug like a raw animal. People ask if it was worth it. Some debts were repaid, some men were exposed, a few $1,000s were shifted into restitution funds, and some contracts were voided. But people also died and people were ruined, and Claire disappeared from my world because the ledger required space to breathe. The ledger did not restore the life I had. It redistributed consequences in unequal pieces. In the quiet, late at night, I open it sometimes and read the names like a priest reading a ledger of sins. The pages are neat because I am nothing if not orderly. There are lines I will never cross out. There are margins where I wrote reasons that sounded like excuses. There is a finality I can never quite manufacture, a sense that I made another kind of house on the ruins, and that house is cold. If there is an endnote to this, it is that truth is not always liberating. Truth is heavy. It is responsible for what follows. You can make it visible, and it will wound those who hide by it, and those who unmask it. You can hand it to the law and hope the law understands the teeth of human lives. You can live with the ledger and keep it like a burn-marked thing that reminds you where you stood and what you did. I keep it because someone has to remember the names, not to punish, not to savor, to remember, because the city will build its comfortable rooms again, and the men who profit from silence will find new ways to stitch seams. The ledger is my modest protest against that habit. Some nights I dream Tom is still alive and knocks at my door. When I wake, the ache in my ribs greets me like an old friend. I pour coffee and turn the page. The book sits in the dark like a sleeping animal, patient, waiting for a hand that might one day write the next line. I am done writing, but the ledger knows otherwise.